Okay, so let's talk about a real paradox in American history. Lyndon B. Johnson. On one hand, he was the architect of a more just America, but on the other, he was the commander-in-chief of a truly disastrous war. So how can one man embody such a massive contradiction? Well, that's the story we're going to unpack today. A presidency of absolutely breathtaking triumphs and, at the same time, devastating tragedies. So the story really kicks off on a day that shocked the world. November 22nd, 1963. President John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. And just like that, in an instant, the presidency falls to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. I mean, talk about a transfer of power born from a total national nightmare. And get this, just 2 hours and 8 minutes after Kennedy's death, Johnson is taking the oath of office. He's on Air Force One, and right there beside him is a grieving Jacqueline Kennedy, still in her blood-stained pink suit. I mean, that single image, it's just so stark. It perfectly captured the sudden violent shift that completely shook America to its core. So right from the start, you see this incredible contrast. Johnson's presidency really is one of the great paradoxes in American history. You've got this story of monumental achievement at home that gets completely overshadowed by a catastrophic war abroad. To really understand how he could be both, the hero and the villain in his own story, we have to go back and look at where his power really came from. Yeah, because to really get President Johnson, you first have to understand Senator Johnson. See, before he ever got to the White House, he was an absolute master of congressional politics, a political operator whose skill at just wielding power was nothing short of legendary. And he was famous for something they called the treatment. Now, this wasn't just your standard negotiation. No, no. This was a physical, psychological event. Johnson was a big guy, and he'd get right up in your personal space, his face just inches from yours, and he'd use every tool in the book: flattery, threats, intimidation, even tears, whatever it took to bend you to his will. It was totally overwhelming, and you know what? It was brutally effective. And his rise to power, it was absolutely meteoric. I mean, he became the youngest Senate minority leader in history. And then, just 2 years after that, he's the majority leader. He was basically running the entire U.S. Senate with an iron grip. This is really where he perfected the art of getting things done. Okay, so now he's president, and he takes all that immense political muscle, that same incredible skill for twisting arms and forcing compromise, and he aims it at a domestic agenda that was more ambitious than pretty much anything America had ever seen before. He called it the Great Society. And he knew exactly what this was going to cost him politically. After signing the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, he apparently told an aide, in private, that the Democratic Party had just handed the South over to the Republicans for a generation. But he did it anyway. That tells you a lot. And the pace of the legislation he passed was just relentless. It was a blitz. Using all those skills he perfected in the Senate, he pushed through this incredible wave of bills that literally reshaped American life. Voting rights, Medicare and Medicaid for the elderly and poor, federal aid for education, fair housing, the list just goes on. And the real-world impact of all this? It was absolutely staggering. During his time in office, the percentage of Americans living below the poverty line was almost cut in half. I mean, it dropped from 23% all the way down to just 12%. That is a remarkable achievement, no matter how you slice it. His vision was just so incredibly broad. The Great Society programs didn't just focus on one or two things. No, they touched almost everything. We're talking about creating public broadcasting, protecting the environment, and even completely overhauling immigration law. But, and this is the big but of his presidency, while Johnson was busy building this new society at home, a war on the other side of the world was quietly growing, and it was casting this long, dark shadow that would eventually just consume his presidency and his legacy. I mean, look at these numbers. When he took office, there were fewer than 17,000 U.S. military personnel in Vietnam. Just 4 years later, there were over 500,000. Johnson was a man who absolutely hated to lose, and he dramatically escalated America's commitment because he was convinced he could not be the president who lost Vietnam to communism. So as the war dragged on and on, this thing called the credibility gap started to open up. Basically, the administration kept telling the public, we're making progress, victory is just around the corner. But then people would turn on the nightly news and see these images that told a very different, much grimmer story of a bloody, unending stalemate. And then in early 1968, you have the breaking point, the Tet Offensive. This was a massive, coordinated attack all across South Vietnam, and it proved to the American public once and for all that the administration's optimistic claims were just false. Now, militarily, it was a failure for the North Vietnamese, but politically, for Johnson, it was an absolute disaster. It showed everyone the war was nowhere near over.
And then something happens that just changes everything. A single trusted voice. We're talking about Walter Cronkite, the CBS News anchor, who was arguably the most trusted man in America at the time. He goes on television and he basically declares the war a stalemate. This was a seismic event.
And Johnson, he got it immediately. He understood the impact. The story goes that he said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He knew that if the public's most trusted voice no longer believed the war was winnable, then the political battle for public opinion at home, well, it was over. And that anger just spilled into the streets. A chant started to pop up everywhere. "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" It became the anthem of the anti-war movement, and you could hear it echoing at protests all across a nation that was now just deeply and bitterly divided. So the war had completely fractured the country, and in the process, it basically broke Johnson's presidency. Think about it. The master politician, the guy who could literally bend the entire Senate to his will, he had completely lost control of the narrative, and with it, his own political destiny. So with his approval ratings in the tank and facing challenges from inside his own party, Johnson goes on national television and makes an absolutely stunning announcement. He says, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." He was done. So this is the legacy he leaves behind. It's this duality, this contradiction that is so profound it's almost impossible to fully wrap your head around. On one side of the ledger, you have these historic, incredible triumphs in civil rights and social welfare. And on the other, a tragic, unwinnable war that cost tens of thousands of American lives and just ripped the nation apart. And that brings us right back to where we started, to that central question. Was he the great society builder, the brilliant legislator who did more for social justice than almost any other president? Or was he the failed war president who led America straight into the quagmire of Vietnam? The truth, of course, is that he was both. And that, right there, is the enduring and incredibly complicated legacy of Lyndon Baines Johnson.